Talkex, ordinary to extraordinary. Welcome to the show. On the show, we have an amazing lady who has 20 years of global HR experience. We're talking about hiring to firing. We're talking about toxic leadership. We're talking about women empowerment. We're talking about diversity. Let's get into her mind and understand how HR truly works. We have Hattie He on the show, Talkex, ordinary to extraordinary. I'm your host, Rohit Basi. Moving on from this, there's always this thing about which is when I'm dealing with people, and I've been hired for these things, is dealing with toxic, not just toxic workplace, but toxic leadership. And look, I'm an external person, I come and do whatever, but you are in that organization and people are in there on a day-to-day basis. How does an organization handle toxic leadership? What do they do, and how can they do that?
So of course, I come across a few, right, those kind of situations. It's typically, it depends on the circumstances. You got to look at what is the situation, what is the circumstances, the individuals in the companies, in the team culture. And when you see the unacceptable behaviors, then you need to have a conversation. Perhaps you need to put a disciplinary process together. You want to get the individual to acknowledge, to aware of certain behaviors is not acceptable. You give them the opportunity to change. And if there are certain people, they don't change, they continue to behave badly, not aligned with the company values and sort of the team spirit in a sense, then I see no other solutions to fire them. Easy. Because sometimes you can't change certain individual, and you certainly don't want to have one bad apple in a barrel, because that's really affect your whole team dynamics, affect your overall business productivity, and it's just not making a happy working environment for the rest of the team. Because we all spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's a lot of time. You want to ensure people working in a happy environment. You don't want that they come in, they continue to play, political games. You want to give them a good, friendly, team spirit environment. When a toxic leader or individual does not meet that requirement, you just need to remove them.
Yeah. And this is interesting, you saying that, where you spoke about one bad apple making the whole barrel just totally bad. I've seen situations where, and especially I've seen this in terms of in a sales environment. There's one individual who's extremely great at sales, and he or she is bringing the revenues, but they have an issue, they are toxic. And it starts impacting the rest of the team. But the leadership team is not willing to let go because they want the revenues coming, and this person is providing that. How do you deal with that?
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
Because those ones brings the revenue in, and they are sort of creating a lot of values for the business. So the leaders reluctant to have certain type of conversations. And I think from HR perspective, we do got to lay it out in terms of what's the behavior, using the examples. In certain situations, there's probably two sides of the story. You got to really look at factual information. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable. The leaders, the manager, got to have that conversation with the individual, give that feedback in terms of how the certain behaviors make the other people feel, what is acceptable, what is not. You got to really set a performance standards, not just from technical perspective, but from soft skills perspective. So that individual got to understand, you know, the performance standards the organization or the managers expected from them. Then it's up to the individual to change their behaviors. Sometimes they change, sometimes they don't. Then you got to have plan B in place to make sure, you know, consider the business risk. How do we scaffolding the situation? How do we, you know, now we come to a kind of another topic. How do you make sure you have a succession planning? And if a certain unethical sales behavior, then you can't, you know, accept that because organizations do want to, you know, do the ethical business practice. If that's the case, then it's not about improving. It's about taking that unethical behavior out of your organization.
Okay. When we're looking at HR, how do you see HR being different here in the Middle East to Europe, UK, Australia, or the Far East? Because you are dealing with HR on a global basis, on a day-to-day basis. What are those differences you see? Is it a cultural thing or is it a legal thing? What is that, what you see? What is the difference?
It's an interesting question. I'm still learning in terms of Middle East HR, and I think it depends on the organization. I have not worked in a local owned business, and I assume that HR practice is very different. And from the country or regional perspective, it depends on how HR progressed, and also depends on how labor legislation progressed, right? Even in Europe, from one country, UK, to Germany, to France, the HR practice or the legal legislation practice is quite different. And same as Asia Pacific as well, you get a kind of quite extreme end. Like in Asia, you can do a lot of things that give employers a lot of freedom to do certain things, where in Europe, in France or UK, Germany, you can't do it because there are so many legislations. Yeah. It's very pro-employee. I think maybe because I'm coming from Australia and I've grown up, you know, progressed in that environment, I think Australian HR is quite balanced. You do consider the legislation from the employer perspective and also from the employee protections perspective. Middle East, I think, is a bit of mixed bag in a sense, right? They do have a lot of European influence, but you've got a local situations you're going to consider, because they do have a different free zones, and different free zones tend to have their own HR rules. It depends on which free zones you are in. And of course, you do have the overall UAE kind of rules, which is overruns the umbrella. I think it's got a little bit of way to go to formalize, to standardize certain HR practice, particularly when one free zone manages totally different from another free zone. I think that's a bit of the HR transformation and changes, looking at what is the good HR practice, whether that's from Europe, from Asia, or US. How do they, looking at those good practices, adapt to UAE environment? Certainly, you can't make the legal legislation standing alone. You got to look at your business environment. You got to look at how do you want to run your country, basically. And then you got to think about what is good HR practice practically for UAE situation.
Being in the position which you are, you're dealing with leadership, you're dealing with management, you're dealing with the whole team. And I see a lot of talk about leadership. If the leadership is right, the rest just fits in really well. With the global experience you have, with the vast different organizations and different industries you've worked with, what is that common thing you see, which you see as, yes, this is what is a good leader or a great leader, or has the potential to be an amazing leader? What do you, from your experience, it's fair enough we read it in books, but from your experience, what have you seen as being a good, great leader?
So I consider myself as been very lucky. In my early career days, I've worked with some great leaders, and throughout my career, I had really good leaders I worked for and I looked up for. From my perspective, I think the leaders, the common themes I see, they're very good at consistency. They have their message consistent to different people, to the organizations, and they're very transparent in terms of their decision making, why they make a certain decisions, what's the reason behind it. They're very good lead by examples.
Okay.
They say what they do, they totally aligned. And also I see certain leaders, they say one thing, they do another, right? But a good leader is, they say what they need to do, they require others to follow, they themselves lead that example. I see all my, good boss has done that. So I learn from them in terms of, if I want people to do certain things, I got to show that, demonstrate that. A good leader, they tend to inspire people. They know what the individual's strengths and gaps, and they give that constructive feedback. They don't beat around the bush. They not always say, oh, you're fantastic, you're great. They tell you, you're good on these areas. Here's the areas I would see that you need to work on or to improve or to close that gap. So you clearly, as someone reporting to that leader, you clearly knows the expectations, you know what your strengths are, you know what's the area you need to work to improve yourself. And also I think one of the biggest things is fairness.
Okay.
A leader needs to be fair to all the individuals, because we're human beings, right? We all like to work with certain people because, we believe the same, we'll have similar environment, and, or maybe even the kids are, study in the same school. You have your commonality things, but you have very different, and you deal with different people, different personalities. But a good leaders need to be fair to everybody. They often, my previous boss often said to me that when you make a decision to one individual, you got to think about, do you make the same decision to others? If the answer is yes, then that decision is a fair decision.
Okay. That seems quite intriguing, because in my experience, or what I've experienced, leaders who have been toxic, which we've spoken about, and I've had experienced leaders who have been amazing, and yes, that fairness comes into play. What I find is challenging when a great leader goes off the track. How do you tell someone who is in that leadership role that, hey, you're going off the track? Especially when you're reporting to them. What does one do in that situation? Because they've been great with them, but now you can see that person is just, how can someone who's junior to them interact with them and get that message across to them? What should they do?
So it's interesting. I'm trying to think while you asked that question. I had a couple of situations where my boss came to me, asked me, did I do something wrong? And I've been honest with her, not to me, to others, right? We were in a meeting, and one of the general managers, this is years ago, I'm talking about it back in Australia, when we have the joint venture sort of situation. And one of the issues came about, and then my boss, basically, also the other person's boss, and got really cranky and shitty and had blasted out of the individual. And after that, I think he reflected upon, and he came to me, asked, did I do something wrong? For me, I can give him two answers. No, you're fine, you're the boss, you can. And I give him the honest answer. I said, yes. And because this is the situation, how do you think he felt, what you could do differently? So we had that kind of one-on-one conversations, and I clearly give him constructive feedback based on the factual information. So that's a leader has self-awareness. They reaching out, they ask, but then depends on who they ask, the individual need to give them honest answer, right? On the other times, I do have people not aware, so you gotta find an opportunity. You can either take a more informal approach, have a coffee, have a lunch, and then just talk about factual information. This is what happened. How do you think the others feel? What's the situation? What caused that person did that? So you help that individual to reflect upon what they've done, and you can have that conversation. Or if it's more serious, then you gotta have more formal conversation about it. You know, if someone made a certain, I guess, unacceptable comment, then you just gotta pull that individual, say, hey, I don't think this is aligned with organization values. This way, it's not the right way to say certain things. So you really gotta point it out. Depends on the circumstances, then you gotta find a different way of managing that, even if it is your boss.
So I just want to I want to close the interview by asking one. This question is for an employee or a leader in the organization, how important is it for them to take care of their emotions?
Yes, it is important, and I think, you know, the employee well-being, wellness is a big topic, and the COVID situation has causing quite a bit of anxiety because, you know, certainly the workplace changed, the people's life changed because of that. Some people may manage it well, others may feel difficult to, you know, to cope, and different people have different personal circumstances. I think these days HR need to think from duty of care perspective, right? We want to provide a good physical working environment for the individual, for employee, as well as we want them to feel that they come to workplace that's safe. There is certain organizations provide certain services that people can go to. We have our well-being certifier, which they can manage the conversation, help the individual to understand what their personal circumstances are. How can we help them from that perspective? So it's become more critical, important from HR perspective. Moving forward, I think, you know, employee well-being, emotional state is become a major topic, I would say, for the next couple of years, because whether that's because of the COVID situation or because of business environment, I think the COVID situation certainly triggered that and speeded up that kind of attention to that particular area.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hattie, for your time. Truly appreciate you being in Talkex, Ordinary to Extraordinary by Exceed College. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Give me the opportunity. Appreciate it.